It's the 13th of December 2010 and I'm sitting in a home in Llanrug in North Wales, which used to belong to the first man ever to win a VC. I'm in the company of a very famous policeman. His name is David Seaborn Davies. His CV, I just have to put glasses on to read this, is quite extraordinary. He works as an international murder, kidnap and missing persons investigator and provides both strategic advice and operational support on intelligence, security protection, threat and risk management, while his international experience includes idents and incidents and investigations in the UK, the US, Mexico, Jamaica, Barbados, South Africa, Russia, Kuwait, Dubai, Australia, Japan, Macau and Hong Kong. And your specialist areas, Di, I understand, are arms trade, consultants, corruption, defence, human resources, human rights, information law and privacy, intelligence law, Middle East, organised crime, risk management, royal protection and terrorism.
Yes.
Where would you like to start?
Well, I don't know who wrote that, but we can condense a huge amount of that down. Essentially, I'm a retired policeman, but had the unique responsibility of being the operational commander in charge of Her Majesty's protection and the entire British family, both all their castles and palaces here in the UK, and indeed worldwide. When they went there, it was my direct responsibility, although I didn't do it all myself, to be responsible, and that ended a career lasting almost 30 years in the Metropolitan Police, ending up in Scotland Yard.
Let's start at the top. I mean, how do you go about protecting the Queen and the royal family?
Well, we've been doing it for centuries, believe it or not. Ever since there have been kings and queens, they've had bodyguards and security. We've merely tried to refine it and brought it into the 21st century, or in my case, last century, because I retired in 1998. But I was a normal, in fact, I'm not sure I was normal, but I was a street cop for 25 years and specialised in actually fighting crime, violence, the IRA and other nice people. And somehow I think they got my CVs wrong, and I was asked if I'd like to go for interview by several eminent so-called policemen, and would I be suitable? And had I'd just been in charge of the Territorial Support Group, otherwise known as the Thick and Stupid Group. They're the people with helmets that you see going in today, and they're a fine bunch of men and women, but not exactly renowned for diplomacy and tact. And being a North Walian, I haven't been always renowned for diplomacy and tact either. But I thought it was a unique position, and I was flattered, as we men are, when offered sort of prominent posts, and I went for the interview, and after 12 people vouched that I was reasonably sane and didn't have too many vices. I wasn't a homosexual, which apparently was despite the previous incumbent having been a one, they still worried whether I was a homosexual. Well, being married now for nearly 40 years, I can vouch for the fact I've never been tempted, but you never know.
Okay, there's so much to draw out from you, but first of all, just tell me very briefly where you came from in North Wales, what your education was, and then we'll pick up the Queen again.
Okay, right. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'll try and cut them shorter. I was born in Carnarvon here, just down the road, to the then town clerk, William Philip Davies, who was from a very strong liberal tradition. His brother was an MP, an emeritus professor, Seaborn Davies, and came from a long family of seafarers and farmers and what have you.
Where does the name Seaborn come from?
Well, it comes from my great-grandfather, who was a master mariner, captain of the vessel you see behind us, and he used to go to Australia. And his father used to take my great-grandmother with him, and as a consequence, he was born at sea, so it became an obvious name, Seaborn. And all the boys in the family have been, and my daughter actually, have been Seaborn. I'm very proud of it. And I started my early youth thinking I could go to sea, and I went on to HMS Conway. I had some romantic vision that a navigator and a ship's officer was a romantic life, and of course in the mercantile marine it's anything but. And the other reason was I thought the girls in Aberystwyth would fancy me in a naval officer's uniform. and some did, and unfortunately the one I particularly liked didn't, so it was a waste of time. And HMS Conway in the 60s was quite a brutal place, some would say, but it was, once you got used to it and adapted, it certainly fine-tuned you to the kind of career I've had over the last nearly 40 years.
And how old were you when you joined the police force?
I was 17, nearly 18. So I left straight from the Conway, and you asked, I had some O's and A's type things, but nothing hugely. History was the only one, and English I liked. And I was accepted into the police force. I'd applied to join either the Royal Marines on a short service commission and the police, having no real notion what on earth the Metropolitan Police was about, except, you know, having been brought up, I didn't like bullies. Conway enforced the fact I didn't like bullies, and I was fairly fast thinking, and I thought the police would be a jolly good career, and it has been. I've loved it.
So where the progression upwards and onwards must have been pretty rapid then.
Well, yes and no. I love being on the streets, and I seemed modestly to have a knack for smelling criminals and arresting them, and within less than a year I was taken off uniform duties onto what was then known as vice duties or crime squad. And I then went on to permanent sort of vice and acted as a sort of undercover officer. In 21 they were putting me into homosexual haunts because it was illegal in those days. Yeah, well, I was slim, I had hair, and someone said I looked quite pretty, but you can see how the ravages of time have diminished that. So yes, I spent 3 years either doing that or on armed protection, because I was foolish enough to volunteer, as you did in those days, to be an armed officer. And the other love of my life, I became an advanced driver. And although after 2 years I passed the probation, I was offered accelerated promotion, because it was a very working class outfit in the 60s and early 70s. They didn't get many public school boys as myself, even Welshmen. And I was regarded as little different in style, in attitude, in behaviour, and this confidence that I seem to have had from an early age, really. But anyway, and the Conway did a lot for that, because they promoted you within and gave you command. At 16, 17, you know, you had 30, 40 boys under your command, and boy, they did what you were told. So anyway, good lesson. So anyway, in the police, I loved being on the streets, and I didn't take promotion until I met my wife, who, and we had our first son, William, after a year, and it became a necessity, because in the early 70s we weren't paid a great deal, and we had a house, a huge mortgage, and she was a nurse but didn't work, so I had to. And so I took promotion, and first time I failed. Second time I worked really hard and came about 10th out of several hundred. And then I realised if I put my mind to things, I could really work. And I had this photographic memory brought about by my father, who was a lay preacher as well as a lawyer. And we used to have to learn the Bible. And in those days, police exams were huge. You had to remember pages and pages of law. And I've had that ability ever since, to scan something and to not repeat it, but certainly to quickly assess things and normally come to a conclusion fairly quickly. And that's proved incredibly useful in my career. And frankly, I can bullshit away merrily for hours.
And how did you make progress up the ladder of promotion in the police force?
Well, you go from constable to sergeant. Sergeant, I went to Hammersmith. And again, got asked did I want accelerated promotion, and I went off to Blackpool or somewhere. And they decided I was too black and white. So in those days, you had to do 5 years, or 4 if you were specially selected. I think they must have sussed out that I nicked the chief constable's sandwiches at 8. And somehow somebody must have grasped me up. So they decided another year as a sergeant was probably good for me. So I'd had a lovely year, 5 years at Hammersmith, which was Shepherd's Bush, tough, rough. It was a punishment station, so some of your officers were pretty rough. Friday and Saturday nights were bundles and bundles on the Broadway there on Shepherd's Bush Green. I loved it, and I've always loved street work, and I went again on to some interesting squads where I spent a year as a sort of detective sergeant running the squad, and I loved it and got involved in all kinds of scrapes, as you do. I was an armed officer. In those days, just 2 of you would carry a gun at 6 in the morning, and off you go, kicking the door, and Chummy was an armed robber. We'd just point a gun and say, "You're nicked." A bit like the Swinney.
Yeah, were you an arrogant copper? You know.
No, I don't think I was arrogant. I was just what they call swift.
Ah.
Do you know that term?
No, but
well, swift means that you're bad, I'm good, you're nicked.
Lovely.
End of story.
Okay, so you're onwards and upwards. Then what?
Then I took a promotion again, and this time I think I came about 5th. Again, intelligence is a key word. I learned off by heart the last 5 years of promotion and questions. So I could, like a parrot, and that's why I almost got top marks, because I could just really, oh yeah, well, it's intelligence. So I did work quite hard, modestly, but I did, and I really studied for sometimes. Unlike the students of today who are paid to do, you had to do it in your own time, and you worked 8, 9, 10 hours normally. So how my wife's put up with me all these years, I don't know.
You should have gone on the stage with a memory like that.
I should have. I should have gone on memory man, shouldn't I? But anyway, it's gone now. I can't do it anymore. But I certainly could in those days. So anyway, I came high, and I was posted to a lovely place called Twickenham. And I don't think Twickenham had seen anything like me for a while, especially the villains. So I just set about, and I became very interested in licensed premises, because the commander, and I think he's still alive now, of T Division as it was there, he was a real old school Welshman, and he didn't like licensees. So I thought, intelligence again, how do I get on very quickly? Well, one, concentrate on licensing, concentrates on raiding pubs, and anything that gets me the attention of this very old-fashioned commander. Well, he thought it was lovely. And I would agree, obviously, with everything he said. It was a jolly good idea. And in 3 years, I was then put up for accelerated promotion again, which is amazing. And I became a chief inspector. And they sent me to Southall.
You're now aged what?
Oh,
roughly.
34, 35.
Right.
And by that time, we had 3 children. We lived in Shepperton. My wife was a full-time mum, because I was never there. So somebody had to be there with the kids. And we had a nice cut by that time. We lived in a detached house in Shepperton, in a nice area by the river. And cut a long story short, I loved Southall, and it was mixing it with the Indians. It had a history of violence. And again, one of the things I did was to realise that there was a huge amount of political correctness and indeed racism in the police. So the first things I did was clean up the place, and we had Operation Shampoo, which essentially was tackling the very violent, armed and dangerous Asian gangs, the Tootie Nungs and the Holy Smokes. And they were organised crime in Southall, and they had protection racket, drug rackets, you name it, and occasionally they would fight. And then we had the political injection. As far as I know, I think I'm the only Welshman ever taken hostage in a Gurdwara, a temple. And by that time, I had done 2.5 years, I think, as a uniformed guy, operations. And I then became the community liaison officer. And my job there was to run the juvenile bureau, which sounds a soft option. It certainly wasn't street work, but also community affairs. So the key thing for the police was intelligence again. And I worked very closely with the special branch to develop informants, to put it one way. And they could be shopkeepers, they could be anything. But the way you do it is walk the shop floor. And I loved Indians, I loved the Sikhs, I loved it curries, and I loved something called Black Label. And then I took over child protection, which was interesting, and that was strenuous at times because of the obvious factors. But Asia, even then, I've always had a thing about protecting women, because I quite like women. So protecting women and children and vulnerable people was a key factor. That's why I despair when I hear the headlines 20, 30 years on. You know, we haven't learned some of the lessons. But that was an interesting. So I spent a year then, and again, I was involved in some of the extreme tensions that were going on when Gandhi was murdered, if you recall, back in India. And so you had factions from India coming over here, terrorists we would call them, and using the Gurdwaras as the way to gather money and all the rest of it. And of course, occasionally you'd have people from Birmingham coming to attack this. And that's how I got taken hostage. The one Gurdwara was taken, and they phoned me on a Sunday, so they won't talk to anybody, they want you. So off I went, and Special Branch and